we've had too many researchers come in and really do harm in our communities. And so there's this level of trust that has to be built up before you can advance in the community itself. So it's a lot of the time at the beginning to develop the relationship. It's a time investment, but it's an investment that's very much needed. And also, it also provides opportunity for community members to understand the priorities of the company, and for the company members to understand the priorities of the community.
So, welcome, Ken. Really grateful to have you here today and welcome you to the co-management podcast that we do, and to be available for questions and answers with our community of practice. And like we talked about today, we're going to delve into this evolving research area of marine carbon dioxide recapture or removal, and we're honored to have you here to talk about it, because I know you've been at the forefront of many of these conversations nationally and internationally, and I've been enjoying attending many of your talks, and you always bring that Indigenous perspective and what things and considerations that industry and researchers should be considering to do this effectively.
Oh, well, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this with Cloudberry. Nililiwas Kapud Muin, Nujaya Wilstuki Nikitcook. So I'm from a native community called Nagutcook, or Totobic First Nation. I'm a member of the Wolastoqey Nation. Our community is located in New Brunswick. Our traditional lands and territories span the state of Maine, New Brunswick, and the province of Quebec. And our identity is really tied very closely to the Wolastoq, also known as the St. John River, but we know it as the beautiful, bountiful river. It's up into the Bay of Fundy, and traditionally we are hunters and fishers. We've had some problems with the interruption of our fishery due to the hydro dams that were built on the St. John River. There are 7 hydroelectric dams in the river system itself. But regardless, because of where we are and what the work the ancestors were, we are also co-signatories of the Peace and Friendship Treaties, from the very first one from 1725, the Treaty of Boston, and all of the other treaties that followed that. So when the Marshall decision came down in 1999, we are, my community is one of the effective communities. Our nation is one of the effective nations. We work very closely with the Mi'kmaq. They're kind of like a sister nation, I guess. There's lots of intermarriages, there's lots of cooperation, there's lots of similarities culturally, and we will support each other when we have to face some legal and political challenges. Career-wise, I have spent 10 years with the Canadian Hydrographic Service as an ocean mapper, working on the eastern seaboard from Labrador, Newfoundland, PEI, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. After that, I was 10 years with Parks Canada, primarily as a senior policy advisor, but I did take a stint in the Northwest Territories as superintendent, 3 of the national parks in the high Arctic, working with the Saulteaux Dene, the Gwich'in, and the Nunavut. But since 2012, I've been working directly for First Nations. I was with the Atlantic Policy Congress as the regional fisheries director, dealing with all of the communal commercial fisheries and licenses under AICFI, as well as the ARON groups. And both of those major programs were created after the Marshall decision came down in 1999. And in 2018, I was the National Fisheries Director for the Assembly of First Nations. But since 2021, I've been working independently on contracts, including lead fisheries negotiation with the Wolastoqey Nation of New Brunswick, my home territory, my home nation, as well as working with groups like Meow-Puck Horizon on the Indigenous-Led science expeditions in Newfoundland. I've done some work with the Nunavut Fisheries and Management Training Consortium on mentorship training for Nunavut fishers. I've done some work with the IOC at UNESCO on Indigenous knowledge in the Ocean Decade, as well as other groups on the Ocean Decade with groups like Ocean Outbursts Canada, Ocean Frontier Institute, Pisces. I'm on the board for Marine Renewables Canada. So this is an industry association that kind of coordinates some of the activities and advocates for offshore wind and offshore tidal. But my last biggest point, I'm on the board for Carbon Removal Canada since the spring. And I guess one of the benefits that I bring to that is an identification of marine carbon dioxide removal, because most of the work under CRC up to the last year had been on terrestrial carbon removal. So I try to bring that expertise in there, and that sort of complements some of the other work that I'm trying to get substantial involvement of Indigenous peoples in the marine sector of carbon capture.
No, you're definitely very, very involved. You must have a lot of air miles saved up now too with all the different travels. But it's good on you to have the endurance to get everywhere. And so for today, I guess what we were hoping to do was unpack MCDR a little bit at first, and then we can get into trying to give some practical approaches. So just for listeners that aren't familiar with MCDR at all, and what this type of research is, like what is the problem here, and what are researchers and industry trying to solve in this field?
Yeah. So as a society, we have a full-scale addiction to carbon. We use it in plastics. We burn it as fuel. We tend to develop lands where there's natural vegetation, where there is carbon capturing vegetation that is no longer capturing carbon. And the problem is accelerating. Like the more that we do this, the more that we are creating problems such as forest fires and other kinds of natural disasters, which are accelerating the release of carbon into the atmosphere. But a lot of people don't really have the knowledge that the ocean is one of the largest depositories of carbon on our planet. And when I was first introduced to this field of work, it was really on ocean alkalinity enhancement. And that is one of the methodologies that is being explored. Um, the concept behind that is that the ocean is slightly acidic. And when the ocean is acidic, it releases carbon. So in order to challenge an acid, you mix it with an alkali to bring the pH level closer to 7. And there is this field of research and practice now, Ocean Alkalinity Enhancement. You'll see the acronym OAE, that is looking to put different kinds of alkalinity in the water systems to try to bring the pH down in order to have more permanent capture of carbon. The challenge in that field is, well, there's several challenges, but one of them is sourcing the alkalinity and make sure that the mixture is not going to harm fish or vegetation or waterfowl or any kinds of natural processes. But secondly is also monitoring. Like when you put things into an ocean space, for example, the disbursement is so large that it's really difficult to monitor the effectiveness of it. But there is a movement around the use of carbon credits as a way to fund some of the research work. So that's currently taking place, but it's a brand new field. Um, when I started into that field, I also started learning about other scientific methods towards marine carbon dioxide removal, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So some of that you can think of as micro-algae, so creating more algae blooms, and there's artificial ways of doing that or enhancing that. Another methodology that it's called macro-algae, so that's basically growing things such as kelp forests, so these large plant organisms that can capture carbon. And another methodology that is being considered is direct air capture, so or direct atmospheric capture, DAC. And then that's basically machines that filter air through a filter to hold the carbon in. You still have to deal with the carbon after it's captured, mind you, but these kind of I guess operations are occurring on land, and they're considering seeing what the viability is in the ocean space. There's other methodologies, but these are the four major ones that we're doing some research with and trying to write some positioning papers through ICES, and we're hoping to get a bunch of these things published in January.
Nice. Yeah, I've seen the call for papers that was recently released by IC, so it'll be interesting to see what manuscripts get submitted and so on. And obviously in Canada, especially reconciliation and consultation and all of the different buzzwords that people are sometimes using a little bit lightly, I would suggest. And in this community of practice, we've heard a lot of people discussing the interest in doing good, I would say, by Indigenous peoples, but still working within colonial structures and not always sure how to do this work in a good way. So what we were hoping to do today was kind of play around with the idea of a case study, and we could talk through it a little bit and sort of see in a practical sense what we could recommend to someone that might be doing research in this particular area. For example, it's obviously a new technology. It's rapidly developing. There's a lot of industry interest in it, which comes with a lot of excitement, but also some challenges and ethical questions. So I guess if we play with that idea and think of a hypothetical scenario that say say a company approached you and they're developing a new MCDR technology and they want to responsibly approach an indigenous community, say it's your community even, whose traditional territories and waters might be affected. So from your perspective, what would be the absolute first step that you would recommend a company should take if they were going to genuinely engage an indigenous community or territory and get off on the right foot with this type of research?
Well, if a company had approached me, the first thing I would do responsibly is learn as much as I can about the company itself, about the personnel, why, like how they formed, how big they are, what methodologies they're actually doing, what kind of testing they've done. Have they done this kind of installations or interventions in other places? So I'd want to learn as much as I can about the company. And then I'd ask them, oh, why are they wanting to work with our nation? Like there must be a reason. Somebody must have either referred them, or they did some online research, or they looked at the water conditions, where the Williston, pours into the Bay of Fundy. Maybe it's the tidal action. I'm not really sure what that would be. Maybe they're looking at the industrial footprint in St. John, New Brunswick, and they thought that would be a good place to work because it's industrialized. It's easier to run operations there. So I'd have to ask a bunch of those questions, and then if we got to the point where I was comfortable enough and had enough knowledge that I would like to do the introductions, the first thing I would let them know is that when you come into any of our communities, the first thing they're gonna ask is like, why are you here? The people appear for a reason. They don't just appear, just out of curiosity or goodness. There's usually a reason why they're there. Um, so they'll ask about that. And the second thing that they're going to ask about is going to say, okay, once they start learning about the methodology and stuff like that, they're going to ask about, well, what's going to be the impact of fish and the natural environment. But I know in all coastal indigenous communities, the health of the fisheries is so important for food security reasons, for ecosystem services, because fish provide that. They feed animals, they feed the soils and fertilize the lands. Um, and also potentially, if they have economic fisheries, like fisheries that are in businesses, they're going to want to know what's the impact there. So that's going to be another major question that they're going to have. But once they start answering those questions in the community level, then probably the questions are going to be, well, how do you want us involved? So the thing I'm finding about this whole MCDR field is that all the science is currently just being developed, and there is no set methodology. There is not going to be one single methodology that's going to resolve all of the carbon issues that we have in the marine sector. So therefore, I think that if the partnerships with Indigenous coastal communities are developed at the onset, that there could be a co-development of the science methodologies, the monitoring, the programs. Indigenous communities can identify areas that need to be monitored. They can have personnel from the communities to do some of that monitoring work, since they're probably going to be residents of that area. There's going to be looking at different kinds of plant and animal species that could be monitored that somebody from the outside may not even think about. They could talk about the different times of year, what the cycle of monitoring should be, whether it should be like on a weekly cycle, monthly cycle, if it should be in the winter months and the summer months. And there's all of these other methodologies that will have to take place and can take place if it's developed as a true partnership. But right off the onset, when anybody comes to the communities, they're going to ask, look, why are you here? And if a proponent comes in is unprepared and doesn't learn about the community before they come in, then they probably won't get too far within the trust level of the community. Like if the community doesn't understand who you are and why you're doing what you're doing, even if it was for the greater good, they may not support it if they don't understand like why are you there? Because we've had too many researchers come in and really do harm in our communities, and so there's this level of trust that has to be built up before you can advance in the community itself. So it's a lot of the time at the beginning to develop the relationship. It's a time investment, but it's an investment that's very much needed. And also, it also provides opportunity for community members to understand the priorities of the company, and for the company members to understand the priorities of the community.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm just wondering, with all your experience now seeing different companies or researchers come and go, are there any particular bright spots or creative approaches or success stories that you've seen that work really well that might be able to be replicated from time to time? Any kind of
Yeah.
ideas like that we could share?
Well, for the most part, what I've seen for successes are usually smaller scale projects. The major projects, um, like I haven't seen a successful major partnership yet on major projects. But there's lots of small successes. Like most of our ARON groups in the Atlantic region, for example, they are working with researchers, they're working with universities, they're working with NGOs, and depending on what you're looking at, they've developed these working partnerships. So it could be on something looking at like salmon habitat in the lower Woolastook, for example. Or if we look at some of our colleagues, like with Listuguj, they have Genu is the ARON up there, and they've got a great partnership going on with respect to traditional knowledge mapping and intellectual property rights protections, as well as many other things. The Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq has done a lot of work in the Bedford or in the Minas Basin. So they're looking at fish habitats there. They are running smoke wheels. So the smaller scale partnerships do work, and and you can't transfer um, necessarily the specifics on the habitat work to other areas, but the methodology of building the relationships, that's what could be replicated. A lot of the communities now and organizations do have protocols in place for proponents that want to come in to do some work in other areas. So I would recommend people like seek that out to see if there's actually like formal written protocols when they come into approach indigenous communities.
And one of I guess if we take it through that step where somebody does come in a respectful way and has done their homework and all parties have agreed that we want to work together on a project, I guess what are some of the next steps you would recommend then beyond that so that a company or a research team can kind of get past that initial low bar idea of consulting, I would say, or just extracting a checkbox and actually digging in and doing true knowledge co-production and so on. But are there some good examples you could point to where true co-production of knowledge happened?
Well, the first time that I've seen it happen at a sizable scale was way back in it was around 2000. Well, it was the late 90s, early 2000s with the Eskasoni Fish and Wildlife Commission. At the time, the Eskasoni is located on the Bedore Lakes, and at the time there was a mentor who was with us named Charlie Dennis, who told me the story of an elder that took him down to Heron Cove or Crane Cove, sorry, in the community and said, "Hey, Charlie, the water here is not as milky white as it used to be. So it seems like the herring aren't spawning here in the same masses that they used to be. Can you find out why that is?" So, and Charlie explained to me that when he started asking questions to the Provincial Department of Fisheries, he found out they don't talk to the Federal Department of Fisheries, or the Federal Department of Fisheries didn't talk to the Federal Environment Department. The Federal Department of Environment didn't talk to the Provincial Department of Environment. And so what he proposed was to do some of the work and train community members to do things such as water sampling, for example. There was cutbacks on field work for a lot of these departments, but he said, like, well, we have personnel. If you train us how to do this work, we'll do the sampling, tell us the maps, and then we'll figure this out, right? So that model of trying to figure out what's best for the lakes is what he had kind of created. And he would say that he doesn't really care like what your job title is, but if you want to come in and help work on the health of the Bedore Lakes, then he'll welcome you in, and you'll be part of like the group as they're all working together. Well, these little projects that he had with water sampling and habitat assessment, stuff like that, all of a sudden became really important after the Marshall Decision in 1999. So the Marshall Decision, it upheld the Treaty of 1760-61, and it really, at the core of it was the recognition of a treaty-protected um, commercial right to fish for Donald Musher Jr. to fish American eels. But out of that, one of the things that the Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans did was create these AROMs. They based the AROM on the model that Charlie had created because he had all five Cape Breton Mi'kmaq bands working together, along with the municipalities on the Bedore Lakes and the county wards on the Bedore Lakes, and made I guess, a platform for provincial and federal departments to actually come work there too, personnel, and that grew not only as an AROM, because the AROMs are science and technical groups for First Nations and Inuit, but it also created this whole CEPI program, which is Collaborative Environmental Partnership Initiative, I believe is what the acronym stands for. And now, whenever there's any kind of major developments or major activity in the Prudhoe Lakes, they all work on this stuff together. It's through the CEPI program that something like MCDR will eventually come through when they're dealing with, if they're going to deal with this on the Prudhoe Lakes level, for example. But that idea of like looking out for what's best in the best interest of the waters and the fish in the waters, if people can have that kind of approach, I think rather than bringing your departmental approach, I think that we'll have much larger chances of success in the environmental field.
Yeah, one of the things that I wonder about as well now, and maybe it sounds a bit dire, but I mean, the whole issue of climate change is certainly one that was not initiated or created by Indigenous peoples, obviously, yet.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking through this idea of MCDR, and if it comes to be at the point that this is a great solution at scale for climate change, but if it potentially does have consequences for indigenous communities or biodiversity or fish species, that type of thing.
Mhm.
There's going to be a huge societal question that has to be debated and thought about again. And I just wonder, how do we reconcile those things as we go forward now and make sure not only do we solve climate change, but make sure that the people that are on the front lines don't
Mm.
now have to pay the full price of fixing it
Yeah.
when it was when they weren't the ones to create it to begin with, for
Yeah.
example, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, if we were to implement all the MCDR strategies at scale, we really would still only capture like 10% of the carbon that's in the atmosphere. The big problem we have as a society is that the tap is still turned on full blast. Like we're not moving fast enough into renewable energies. I know we have to have energy sources, but carbon-based fuels is still the number one fuel that we exploit as a people. So MCDR is a part of the solution, but it's certainly not the solution. We have to curtail our consumption levels. Um, the other thing about specifically with communities, um, so the government of Canada does things because it's legally obligated. First and foremost, all of the fisheries programs, for example, that we see that DFO has right now, all of those things in those fisheries programs were illegal 40 years ago. It was just that there were Indigenous leaders that had challenged the system. They had gone to Canada's courts, hiring lawyers that knew Canada's laws to challenge a lot of the things that had happened. And this is why we have the Sparrow decision. This is why we have the Marshall decision. We have other things like the Haida Taku court decisions, which talk about consultation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So everything that we enjoy now with respect to the rights-based aspect is something that Indigenous peoples have been fighting for. And like I never take any of that for granted, but there is an obligation, a federal obligation now for Indigenous peoples towards Indigenous peoples, or legally, actually, it's Aboriginal peoples because that's what's in the Constitution. There's really no legal definition of Indigenous peoples, but that's the wording we use now. Um, so if there is a potential for an impact on inherent Aboriginal or treaty protected rights, the government of Canada is culpable. All right. So, and the government of Canada is the one that establishes permits for mining, for building of roads, for interventions in the ocean space, such as MCDR, et cetera, or they delegate that authority off to the provinces. So there's a legal responsibility towards that. Um, if anybody goes through a master's, an MBA program, or even a Bachelor of Business Administration program, they'll start learning and hearing about the triple bottom line. So everybody knows that your bottom line is primarily financial. Everybody talks about the economic bottom line. But the other two aspects of it now that businesses now have to address is people. So that's the corporate social responsibility and the environmental bottom line. So in other words, if you loot a place, then you're going against the environmental bottom line, and that means that you're probably not going to have sustainable business in that area. If you don't take care of your corporate social responsibilities, that's your people, that's your workforce, that's your residents, then you are also not going to be able to sustain your business model. So from the business perspective, there is a social responsibility to work with coastal Indigenous communities who are going to be impacted by a lot of these interventions. And also, it kind of makes good business sense in that you could potentially develop that as a workforce. You could potentially get new knowledge or new methodologies because they are local, they know the environment, they've been living there for generations upon generations. They understand weather patterns, they understand the terrain, the water, the moods of animals, the migrations of fish, those kind of things. So there are a whole bunch of things that are really important there as well. So it's kind of like you both have a carrot and a stick, where there's a legal responsibility, but there's also a benefit for doing this kind of good work. I mentioned before, we've had a lot of people exploited our Indigenous communities over many, many years, researchers, governors, business people, you name it. They've taken the mythical traditional knowledge, whatever you define that as, because it was never defined by our communities. Those aren't our words. This is somebody else coined those phrases. But regardless, they've taken information away from our communities as extractive and used it for their benefits, sometimes to the detriment of the Indigenous communities. But despite all of that, elders are still wanting to share information because they see what is happening through climate change, through disappearing fish stocks, through the changes of vegetation, and they know that keeping data, information, methodologies towards yourself is not going to help the greater good. But we have to do it in a very respectful, protective way. One of the ways, if a business comes into a community, they could provide funds to the community to support the development of elders' knowledge. I'd like to talk about the investment into Indigenous knowledge systems, the investment into our communities, investment in our elders, because knowledge is not one of those things that stays static. It continues to adapt and evolve. And if we are able to have access to modern equipment such as drones, satellite imagery, vessels, labs, all the GIS systems, all of these other management tools, in the field tools for sampling, then we can continue to adapt our Indigenous knowledge systems so that it'll be, I guess, more modernized. It'll be something that can be potentially used in partnership with some of the other science activities that are taking place. So instead of just looking at programs, I'm looking at investment or partnership from corporate entities into the communities itself. Um, Another thing which is also really important, I'm hoping people don't look at the ocean as a single thing that has a problem that we want to go in and correct. I'm hoping people will understand that the ocean is a living being. It has a spirit. Certainly, Indigenous communities understand this. We do ceremonies to the waters, and that that acknowledgement of the ocean as a spirit helps us to, I guess, respect the relationship we have. So when companies come in and they don't have that same kind of sensibility towards understanding a relationship with the ocean, that's something that they may have to make themselves a little bit more vulnerable to and listen to the Indigenous peoples and let Indigenous peoples lead in some of the aspects of the research.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And one of the things I know I've noticed is sometimes people kind of have these stereotypes, or they look at things in black and white, so to speak. And I've heard sometimes you see a lot of the academic literature will debate, well, you got Western science and you got indigenous knowledge. And more I hear and see an interest on behalf of indigenous peoples to be trained in Western sciences and want to know what Western science is also saying and learning. And are you noticing yourself an increasing interest of indigenous youth coming up wanting to get trained similarly to the way you did? Like your own background in the natural sciences really puts you in this unique position to be able to participate in these discussions in a really good way.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I've seen like so right now we're in the fifth year of the International Decade, the UN International Decade of Ocean Sciences for Sustainable Development. And right off the bat, there was this major focus on Indigenous peoples, specifically Indigenous knowledge. They call it Indigenous knowledge. I call it Indigenous knowledge system because I want people to understand it's a methodology. It's not just knowledge that you know. Those wording also are present in the post-2020 framework of the Convention of Biological Diversity and also in the UNFCCC for the Climate Change Accords. So globally, the idea of working with Indigenous peoples is there. However, the challenge I have for these nation states is why aren't you actually doing it? Why do you like? There's a lot of talk about doing it, and there's a lot of like intention on doing it, but it just seems that there is a hesitancy to actually make those first steps. Some of the reasons I think amongst the science group is, well, they first of all, it's Indigenous peoples are an unknown entity. People are hesitant because they don't know Indigenous peoples. Another hesitancy is that they don't know who the Indigenous peoples are, or they don't know what organizations or communities or institutes to engage with. And that's where you have to do your own online research. Another fear, I would say, is people are afraid of making a misstep along the way. Because when you make a misstep at the beginning of a relationship, you may not continue on with the relationship, you know. Um, and I guess the fourth big thing is people tend to think of Indigenous peoples in the stereotype of the noble savage, of the, looking on the shoreline and looking off and thinking deep thoughts and being very stoic and whatnot. But like we're all very unique people, just like the rest of societies. And we don't separate or talk about treaty rights, inherent rights, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples from our family work or from our community work. And it's hard. And plus, we're also dealing, especially in Canada, with the legacy of the residential school systems, the problems with the Indian Act, the problem with Northern Development, and all of these other legacies that are like intergenerational. So we have a lot of things we're trying to sort out. At the same time, we're trying to make these positive contributions to society, and specifically in this case, to mitigating carbon pollution into our atmospheres. So all of that is part of the formula that we have to like consider when we deal with all this kind of stuff. Despite that, I'm finding that the science groups are also acknowledging and recognize that separated hardcore science doesn't really work really well with local natural environments. This is why they have to come to the communities. This is why they have to understand like the different physiology of the ocean space, the currents, the shorelines, the vegetations, what other kind of activities are going on there. Is there shipping activities going on there, fishing activities? Are there large ocean currents that are shifting and changing? Are there changing weather patterns? Um, One of my elders, Albert Marshall, he and his wife, Merdina Marshall, who's passed, came up with this concept called two-eyed seeing, which a lot of people will sort of recognize in the science fields in Canada, but very simply at Tuapamuk. But what people understand of it is like you use your Western knowledge, your Western science approaches on one vein, using one eye and using your indigenous knowledge approaches with your other eye, and then you would have a much richer result. But what people are missing, and Albert says he told me like what people are missing in all of this is the integration part of that. So in that area of integration, because you can't just do separate science things, you actually have to integrate them together. And in that area of integration, you're going to find conflict. But you have to work through those areas of conflict because that's where you'll find your innovation. And a two-eyed seeing approach in one area is not necessarily going to be directly transferable to a different area because the local environments will be different, the people are different, the knowledge systems are different. But that is another way of incorporating Indigenous communities is by embracing their Indigenous inherent knowledge systems, but potentially looking at it through a two-eyed seeing approach, where you're going to bring all the knowledges together in a safe and respectful way in order to come up with the best possible science.
Yeah, I wonder, like for someone like yourself with your own life history and background, and then being trained in the Western sciences the way you were, and having worked up through government and so on, does it make it easier for you to kind of implement two-eyed seeing when you're kind of thinking through these things, or do you too have to kind of be really conscious about that and how you approach it?
Yeah. Well, I would say it would makes it easier for me to implement. But I'll say like the advantage that I have of working so many years with the federal government is that I understand scientists. I understand the language that they use. I understand the methodologies and some of the pressures that they're under because they have very strict methodologies through the CSAS process or through their own departmental processes. And I also spend a lot of time with academics and much in the university crowd. So I understand a lot of like how their research methodologies are very, very strict and how they run on research grants, how they have to publish. Um, that world is completely different in Indigenous communities. The Indigenous communities are looking at food security, they're looking at land security. There's all these concepts like fish back and land back that are now hashtags that kind of go around. But I'm seeing a lot of progress in Indigenous communities over my lifetime, for sure. And it's just that resilience of the community. And really, I think the strength of the Indigenous communities today is also coinciding with that return back to culture, because it's that cultural grounding. that the knowledge from the ancestors, the approach from the ancestors that puts down the foundation, which makes people stronger today and able to adapt. So I'm kind of lucky to have exposure and working practices in those both those worlds. Um, but what I also try to do is I try to communicate across these different sectors. So when scientists are explaining things to me, such as ocean alkalinity enhancement, well, I wouldn't go into a native community at a community session in a community hall and talk about OAC or OAE. I would talk about, well, we have a problem in the ocean where it's a little bit acidic and we want to develop something to bring the acid down a bit so that the carbon that gets released is not going to go up to the atmosphere. So you just change the way that you describe it so that people in the community can understand. And similarly, when you sit down with community members, often they'll tell you stories. And if a scientist is not understanding this and they're hearing these stories and they're hearing them out of context, they'll say, well, why are they telling me stories? But if you're able to understand sort of the context of like how the community has evolved over the years or over the generations, some of the understanding of the landscapes in that area, some of the legal things that have happened over the years, some of the family dynamics, and explain that to the scientists, then they understand that yeah, there's ecological information into these things and methodologies that we never would have thought about if we hadn't spent that time in there. So I do a lot of explaining across the different sectors. And this is why I really have to work hard to understand things before I actually start talking about them.
Was there any kind of final word that you'd like to share, or any kind of thought that we didn't get out that you think would be important on this topic for people?
I would just say that everything that we do today, like we have an impact, and there's no individual that's going to solve climate change, but we can all work within our circles of influence to mitigate and do positive things. Your circle can be large, your circle can be small, and your circles will change over the years, depending on where you are in your career. But at least try to do the good things now, and because if you start thinking that you need to solve climate change, that leads into negative thinking because we can't do it. And I would rather have people have an optimistic view of the future that we can do things despite all of the problems because it's easy to find problems. It's easy to find negativity in the world. Like just go on any social media, they feed you that. You watch any television program, they feed you that through their commercials, right? But I think we have to have this positive outlook of the world and work towards the things we can for the future generations because that's what the ancestors did for us. They did all that hard work. They had their community debates so that we could live here in this society. Um, in the future will be the ancestors. So I'm hoping our descendants look upon us and said, well, you know, Ken and Jamie did what they could in their realm there, and we want to continue on that work. I feel like I'm just continuing on the work from the ancestors, and I'm hoping other people can understand that too.
Thanks. I think that's an excellent way to conclude. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to working a lot more with you, Ken, and following along as you make a difference in this field and all the work that you do. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for the invitation.